Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We're going to do the Maimer now of Shabbos, Parshas Pinchas. The year that it was set 40 years ago, that was the Shabbos before Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. But from the subsequent Mamorim of the year, it'll catch up now, and all the Parshas and the dates will be the same. That being said, let's go straight to the Maimer. Some very interesting topic here at hand. And as every Maimer, it's fundamental, inspirational, gives us strength, power, and encouragement to help us in everything that we have to do through Torah and through application, applying it to our lives. We read in this past week's Parsha, this past Shabbos, the Parsha of Pinchas, and in it we read something which we actually say twice a day, every day of the year, and that's the offering, the daily offering, which was brought in the morning and in the afternoon. We also read this every Rosh Chodesh, and then we read it also on Parshas Pinchas. So let's begin. Tzav es Bnei Yisrael v'amart alehem es karboni lachmi li Yishai goimer v'amart alehem zeho isha esher takrivu laHashem goimer. So God was in the midst here of speaking to Moses, and he says, command the children of Israel and say to them regarding the offering, my sacrifice, which is my bread for my burnt offerings. And say to them, this is the burnt offering which you shall offer up to God, etc. We know how our Rabbeim specifically learned a lesson from this by deducing in the particular way this is written in the Torah. Bilakut Torah b'drushat murazokin shenismenu b'mare mekoimis v'tziyunim lelakut Torah v'chein b'drushat murham tzoi v'atzemach tzedek shenismenu shom v'oid. So we find this in the Mamorim of the discourses of the Rabbeim that are in Likutei Torah of the Alter Rebbe and in the other Mamorim of the Alter Rebbe, and they are notated in the references that there are in the back of the Likutei Torah. And just from a quick historical standpoint, in 1984, 40 years ago, when this Maimer was said, that year the Likutei Torah was republished with many, many more references. And the Rebbe spoke about it a few times and spoke about it, campaigned more for learning Likutei Torah, and he was very happy with that edition, and all the subsequent editions are based on that edition. It was still published again with even more references and notations. But here the Rebbe brings it in the Maimer. Now, it doesn't say this explicitly, but it's more than implicit how much, how the Rebbe appreciated and encouraged the references and notations so that we should do further study. And we should be able to understand what is written from looking in the references. And that also includes the Mamorim of the Mittler Rebbe, the son of the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Ber, AChassidic Tzedek, the third Rebbe, which are also referenced in their works. And then the Rebbe says, and there are other, meaning the subsequent Rebbeim too, Rebbe Marash, and the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe's Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, and our Rebbe. What does it say in Chassidus about this? There's an obvious question in this verse. It says, command the Jewish people, and then the next verses it says, twice in this paragraph, and say to them. If Moses is already speaking to them, it doesn't have to say V'amart alehem twice, and you should say to them. You're already talking to them. It doesn't even have to say it once. It's enough to say command them, and of course he's gonna use a PowerPoint presentation. He's gonna say it. He's gonna say it. So, but nevertheless, it says say to them, and say to them. It says twice. So the Rebbe says, Ma hu shenemar kan beis pamim v'amarta. Why does it say twice here? And you shall say. Gam tzorach lahav, we have to also understand the hini yadua mashom razal. Tfilas v'mokum tamidim tiknun. It is well known that which our sages taught us, that the prayers were instituted in the place of the daily offering of mokum acherisa, And the sages also taught us, this is actually a reference to the Zohar, Isa shehat filis niskenu keneged kol hakorbanos b'chlal, that the prayers were also instituted in lieu of all of the offerings, not just the daily offering. There are other offerings too, the weekly, the monthly, the holiday, the private, the individual ones, etc. But tzarech lahavin mahu inyan hakorbanos madua inyan hakorbanos kipshuton hoy bizman habayis davka. So now the Rebbe is going to speak about something just in general, how it worked. So first of all, we only had the offerings, the sacrifices, in the actual sense when the Beis HaMikdash, when the Holy Temple was standing. This was all the years from when the Jews were in the desert till when they went into the Holy Land for around 400 years. They had the sanctuaries in the various places. Then the temple was built by King Solomon, and it stood for 110 years, for 410 years. Then there was exile for 70 years, and there were not offerings then. And then it stood subsequently for another 420 years, the second temple. Then that was destroyed close to 2,000 years ago. And now we're in the period of the mourning period, M-O-U-R, where we are focusing on the loss of the temples with our eye on rebuilding the temples and rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash with Mashiach coming by our actions and deeds and focus and studying about the Beis HaMikdash and about the Holy Temple in this 3-week period. So, nevertheless, the Rebbe speaks about the fact that the actual sacrifices were only brought when the temple was standing. So we have to understand, why were the sacrifices only brought when the temple was standing? And after the destruction, we don't have the physical offerings of bringing up the animals in an actual sense anymore. In other words, if there's the mitzvah to do it, it could still be done. Why is it not done anymore? And we still have the idea of the offerings and the sacrifices in its spiritual sense, by prayer. So this idea of coming close to God, korban, the word of offering and sacrifice really comes from the term of korev, to be close. This tells us that it's the idea of the offerings are pertinent now too in this day and age. And besides the fact that even when the animals were brought physically, whether it was a goat, a sheep, a cow, whatever it was, a bull, a bird, even then there had to be the spiritual aspect of the offering. Its meaning, it didn't only have to be abstract, but it had its spiritual effect and its spiritual meaning, etc. And like Rashi says in the when he comments on these verses, that this is for all the people. So the Kohanim, the priests, the Levites, and the Israelites who stood there, they were all involved. The Mizeh Yisrael b'ma'amodam. One of the things that we had in the Beis HaMikdash is that there was involvement of the Kohanim, who they actually did all the service in the Beis HaMikdash, the Leviim, who did also other services, but they were all involved. And then there always had to be the Anshe Mishmar. There was always a representation of the whole Kalal Yisrael and made up of Yisraelim, who fasted, who prayed, who said special prayers, who were there for a week at a time in the temple. And that was because everything that was going on there was for everybody. So from the fact that there was a representation of everybody, what did they do? They were there for the spiritual intent. And then what those Israelites were doing with their being there and their prayers and their fasting, that wasn't only for them, that was also for the Levites and for the Kohanim. It was for everybody, and it was their part in it. So if that's the case, why is it that the sacrifices are only in the time of the Beis Hamikdash and we don't do it now? So the Rebbe explaining the Mamorim in the discourses. The Mash and Emakam Beis Pom B'Marto who connected Beis Hoinyonim Shnei Hoinyonim Shebekarbonis. That which it says here twice, and you shall say, corresponds to the two aspects that we have in the offerings. The first time where God tells him, and you shall say, that's a reference to the part of the sacrifices that are in the thought and speech. Ruchnius, the spirituality part of it, the more abstract. And the second time it says, and you will say to them, that's a reference to the instructions of how it's done physically, to take the goat, to take the sheep, etc. And like Rashi says, the second time when it says, and you shall tell them, to the judges, they represent everyone, the court. Even though the karbonis belonged to each and every Jew, because everyone had to give every year half a shekel. And from the half shekel, they bought the carbon. And we know mathematically, you could divide up every half shekel into all 355 days of the year, times 2. Each one got a drop of each carbon. That's how it worked. But how did that happen in a practical sense? But when they collected all the money, it all went into one chamber where they kept the money when they bought the offerings. But that became something called communal funds, communal money. And then they would purchase those animals from that money. And then the court was in charge of how this purchasing was set up, and to make sure that there should be a steady supply of animals, etc. And the Beis Din would then set aside the purchased animals for the offerings, etc. And that was on behalf of the whole community, the whole congregation. Now, this just strengthens our query, our question. Why was this only when the temple was standing? This idea that there are thought, speech, and deed, really there is in every mitzvah. Every mitzvah has an aspect of thought, an aspect of speech, an aspect of the actual deed, the performance of the mitzvah. The kavanas mitzvah hi bechinas machshava. The intent of the mitzvah, every mitzvah has a deeper meaning, and sometimes it's easy to realize what it is. Let's take a famous mitzvah saying Shema. When we think of the unity of God, we have to say it, but then it also affects us. It affects our belief, our trust, and our day-to-day life when we say the Shema. So that's the kavanah. That's the intent. When you say the bracha before you perform the mitzvah, that's the speech. That's when we talk. Before we say Shema, we read the blessings in the evening, in the morning, etc. And then when we do the mitzvah, so here it's recitation. It happens to be a mitzvah that's done, the action is a speech. But then let's say before you put up a mezuzah is to guard the house and to remind us of God. And then we have to know the intent of the mezuzah. And then we say the blessing and we hammer it up. We put it on the doorpost. So you have all three aspects. And every other mitzvah is like that. But the Rebbe explains that even mitzvahs that are like only in your thought, let's say fear of heaven, has also all these aspects that come along with it. And the more mitzvahs that you have, that you do, have all these aspects too. So here the Rebbe says, even the mitzvahs that are thought mitzvahs, fear of heaven, love of heaven, etc. And mitzvahs that are just, let's say, done with speech. Let's say prayer, Torah study, even the recitation of Shema. Gam bohem yesh machshava dibur ma'aseh. They also have thought, speech, and deed. Kim move on. We understand from the Tanya. Everything the world has, a part of it, it has levels, it has layers. So it's thought, speech, and deed. Even in thought, there's thought within thought, the more abstract. And then when the idea starts to develop. So that's the next stage of the thought process. And then the resulting, when you really understand something, that's the action of the thought. When you speak, also, you have to think about what you say before you say it. So there's thought involved in the speech. And then there's the speech part of what you're going to say. It's the next. It's the stage of the expression. And the actual action that's accomplished by whatever it is that you do from speaking. And when you have to do something like hammering a mezuzah, again you have the thought, speech, and deed. So everything has all three aspects of him. So what's the difference of the karbonos, of the offerings? The other mitzvahs we do now. We take a lulav now, we put on tefillin now, we hammer a mezuzah now, we eat kosher now. We each and everything has is mitzvahs that perform. So why is it that was limited to the time of the temple? And the mitzvah of the offerings we have nowadays only in speech and thought, in the prayer, but we don't actually do it. Now the Rebbe explains, but here's what it's all about. Regarding the offerings, it says, God says in the parsha that we just read in Pinchas, that this is on, that the offering is a pleasant smell, a pleasant scent for God. What does that mean? This word of nichoyach, reach nichoyach, pleasant, pleasing. What's pleasant? So the word pleasant also is a common word that we use in Hebrew, nachas. Nachas means pleasure, pride, enjoyment, all these things together, all these nuances. So it's an explicit pleasure before me because God says, I said, and my will was done. They did my will. They performed my will. The effect of the offering is that it brings about this great pleasure to God. And here it doesn't only mean, here it means the godly spirit. The pleasure, the level of pleasure, so to speak, which is higher, just like within a human being, pleasure is higher than all the other emotions and feelings. As a matter of fact, there's the will and the pleasure, Ratzon and Tainug, and Chassidus discusses at length, various places, which one is higher, they always come together, which is the chicken comes before the egg. Because you have pleasure, you have the will to do it, or you have the will to do it, and that's where you have the pleasure from it, etc., etc. They're both not limited to any spot, or they're both higher than our psyche and our being, and it's the deepest part. So just like it is with a human being, we're created in the image of God, so this reaches God's pleasure point, so to speak. It's a pleasure for God in an inwardly fashion. A very, very inner pleasure. And through what? How does this pleasure come about? Because God said, and we did His will. The action brings about the pleasure. When we do something, that makes God happy and pleased. So that means that what He wanted got done, was acted upon. There was the deed. We fulfilled His will or His pleasure. So His pleasure came because His will was done through a deed. Davka yideha asiya, through action. Through the action, it gets to the most inner part of his pleasure. Because everything which is so lofty and high, the higher it is, then the lower it can reach. So here, the lowliest part of what we do then reaches the highest format of God's pleasure. So here we take an animal, and for that matter, every offering had mineral, vegetable, animal, and the human being, all four levels, and they came together in these offerings. So not every offering, of course. There's some that only had from mineral or vegetable, etc. We're not going to get into that right now, but this brings the pleasure before God. So the lowliest could make this pleasure. That's the whole idea of all mitzvahs that are performed here on this low world, the physical world with physical objects. That's the whole goal, that we make a dwelling place for God in this lower world by manipulating and using physical objects to perform the will of God, in the performance of mitzvahs. So that's everything, not just offerings. In this lowest world, there's nothing lower. And we bring, by the action of the instruction of God here down in this lowly earth, the pleasure before God, and we bring that in, we combine and we fuse heaven and earth. Nevertheless, there was something special about the service of bringing the offerings in the time of the temple and in the holy temple specifically. The ultimate intent of creation, when God said, make me a dwelling place here on this earth, isn't only that he should have pleasure, but more so, there should be a dwelling place, and there was one spot on earth, and that was the holy temple, where you could actually physically see the dwelling of God and the godliness on earth, with the various miracles that were done. There were the 10 miracles we read about a couple of weeks ago in the Ethics of the Fathers and Pirkei Avos, and some of them were continuous and constant. One of them is one of them that we're going to read about right now. So God wanted there to be a place where there were, in a revealed sense, you'd be able to see God and godliness. And you would be able to see that because we do what God wants, the pleasure will be before God. This was specifically through the offerings, like it says in the Talmud and Tractate Yuma. This is a reference to the miracle. Fire came down from heaven and went down onto the Mizbeach. Mitzvah lahavi min hahedjit. Nevertheless, the mitzvah was also that the kohen had to bring the logs and wood, and also we had to do a fire here. And there was the fusion of these fires. How we were able to see, and it was recognizable, visible, how the fire that was brought from the human being, the regular individual, albeit a kohen, here on this earth, draws down the supernal fire from heaven, and this was actually manifested in a physical sense. We could see a fire coming down from heaven, and one of the ways that this is illustrated is in the miracle that the Pirkei Avos says there, that there was always a pillar of smoke going straight up, and no matter how windy it was a straight pillar. So you were able to even see this miracle from far away, even if you weren't present in where the altar was. You're able to see a godly manifestation in a revealed sense. And you'll be able to see the fusion of Israel and the Holy One, blessed be He, through the offering. That's why this verse also says command. The word for command is tzav. Tzav, the word for command, also has the connotation and implication of connection. So that connects us to God from the same terminology. Hoya Gamkin Begoli, and this was in a revealed sense. And this is something that the offerings had over the rest of the mitzvahs. The Hine mitzvah tzitzis al derech moshe. Let's take, for example, the Rebbe says the mitzvah of tzitzis, of the four-cornered garment that has the fringes. So the tzitzis becomes a very holy thing where you're performing the mitzvah of the king, and by spreading over the talis or the talis cotton over you. We're not able to see in a revealed sense. We could think about it, and then we realize this is godly, and it looks godly. We see somebody with a talis, you see the tzitzis, so we have to think about it. But you don't just see God automatically. It has to have some explanation. It has to have a thought process. So it's not in a revealed sense. You don't see it as a miracle, so to speak. Well, there's the mitzvah of tefillin, and then you have the mitzvah of tefillin, which is also very esoteric and godly. We wrap the tefillin. The gam k'sheminiach tefillin al zrei can I get a lev when the tefillin is placed on the bicep near the heart. Valadosh b'makom shemeichel tina kreifes, and on the head, the place where the skull of an infant is softer. That's how the halacha says where the tefillin has to be from the hairline, and it can't go back further than where the soft spot on a baby's head is. But here the Rebbe, I believe, brings this here, particularly to illustrate to us the way that every mitzvah has its detail, and it's a very physical, and it's something that's done with instructions and parameters. Nevertheless, we don't see the godly part of it unless we think about it and we tune in. Keneged hamoyach, and that tefillin of the head is over the intellect, over the brain, which therefore we know the deeper meaning of this is to subjugate our emotions and our thought process, etc. But that's all with it's all with contemplation. The person subjugates their heart and their mind to serve God. Like we learned in the Code of Jewish Law and the Shulchan Aruch, and especially the way the Alter Rebbe brings it as part of the halacha. He says that that's an actual part of the mitzvah to have in mind when you put on tefillin, that you're actually subjugating your emotions and your intellect for a godly purpose, because God took us out of Egypt and we were in servitude there in bondage, and now we serve God instead. And that's part of the mitzvah. The significance of the mitzvah, to have that in mind, is part of the performance of the mitzvah, of tefillin. But you don't see this in a revealed way. This only comes with education and contemplation. And also in the rest of the mitzvahs. All the Torah is compared to tefillin, as the sages say. So tefillin is a very general mitzvah, but it represents all the mitzvahs. But when it came time to the offering, they were able to see when the kohen set up the little bonfire on top of the altar, there were a few fires, that brought down the fire from heaven, and people were able to see that. So that was an open miracle and an open godly manifestation on earth. So then it was a yuvon. So then the Rebbe says, with this we can understand. That's why we only had the physical offerings when the temple was standing, ubebeis hamikdash, and in the holy temple. Now I would think, if the greatest pleasure comes to the lowest, specifically uchenal, and as we mentioned, whatever is the highest, the loftiest, then is drawn down to the lowest. Like elsewhere in Chassidus, there we have the example, like when there's a brick wall, if the whole wall topples, the bricks that are on the highest part of the wall fall furthest away from the wall. In other words, the higher something is, the lower it goes. So im kain, so if that's the case, then the Rebbe says, Harei zman hagolos v'chutz la'aretz hu zman ha'mokom tachten b'yeser, hu zman ha'mokom tachten b'seich elamazah tachten gufa. So the Rebbe says, wait a minute, if this is the case, then we should first have to bring the offerings now. In the time of the temple, there was all this manifestation of holiness, but in the time of the exile and outside of the Holy Land, so in time and space, This is the lowest of this world, of this lowly world, particularly in this time. And especially then in the end of the days of Golus, it's called the heels of Mashiach. The level of the heels, the heel is not only part of the lowest part of the body, but it's the lowest part of the body. The lowest part of the lowest part of the body. The heel is the lowest part of the foot. It's the lowest in relation to the head. If so, why aren't there offerings? And it should be in not only in Eretz Yisrael, but we should say that we should have to have offerings, and even not in Eretz Yisrael, in the exile, in the diaspora. But according to what we said, move on but like we explained, that the idea of the offerings is the fusion with God, and in its ultimate, and it'll be the ultimate revelation more than other mitzvahs. So then we could only bring it in a time and in a place which is most befitting for such a thing, in the holiest place on earth, and in the time when the temple is standing, when it's not exile, etc. That's the most the best time for such a thing. That's why it's brought then, because it has to illustrate the fusion of God and the people. So Golus has a different thing. But the time of the exile, which is a time of when things are hidden, things are concealed, then we can't bring the offerings in a physical sense because of the concealment of the exile. So this is also something that has to be then in the more abstract sense. And that's why the verse says twice, the Amarta, and you shall say, from this we understand that the Karbonis have two things. The Inyan v'Amarta ha'alef, the Koyal Machshava Divish v'Karbonis. The first one is about the esoteric and the abstract, the spiritual part, the thought and the speech of the offerings. Inyan zeh v'chol mokum v'chol zman. And that aspect is relevant and pertinent in every place and every time, eternally, everywhere. Well, that's why it said by itself, individually, because we have that aspect, and that aspect we never lost, and that aspect we have now. And then it says another special thing about the offerings. The action, the deed that has to happen for an offering. And within that action, we are able to recognize, and it's revealed, this idea of the unification and being fused with God, with the Holy One, blessed be He. It has to be in place and time when things are at their optimum. Bebeis Hamikdash, in the Holy Temple. But now the Rebbe says, but wait a minute. If we the flip side of the coin, since the time of the exile is a time and a space and place which is the lowest of so low, much lower than the time of the where the temple was standing. That will then from this we understand that we have the advantage of then having even a greater dwelling place for God, because we're at a lower location, we're at a lower standard. The because whatever is higher falls lower. This is a time when we're even lower down than when the temple was standing. So then if that's the case, now here, listen to what the Rebbe is saying here. This is something very phenomenal, because the Rebbe just took time and explained to us that we needed an optimum conditions to be able to bring the offerings. Then we have Golus in exile, where things are concealed, and therefore we can't do it. But then the Rebbe says that is the ultimate of how God's presence is in the format that we do it now by not doing it. And this is something where we have to look, so we have to look very carefully. We have to look very carefully. Kinal the cholagavaya b'yoser yerid l'mata b'yoser. Whatever is higher falls lower. Well, therefore, specifically here, we could say that God's will was fulfilled in its optimum way. That's what the sages said. The prayer was instituted in the place of the daily offering. We're able to fulfill the idea of the offerings also in the time of the exile. But how? In thought and in speech. Speech doesn't only include the blessing on the commandments, like we mentioned earlier, but it means also learning the laws of the mitzvahs. Like it says in the Talmud, that whoever occupies himself with studying the instructions and the laws and the Torah about the offerings, it's as if they brought the offering. And that's the same with the speech about mitzvahs. There are a lot of mitzvahs that we don't say a bracha when we perform them. So then where's the speech about them? Right? The Rebbe says, for example, all the negative mitzvahs, you don't do something, you don't say not to eat pork. You don't have to say a mitzvah on that, you just don't do it. Right? So but there's the learning and the mitzvahs about it. And it's brought in the authorities this idea. All these things, these mitzvahs, the speech of those mitzvahs are when we study them, we talk about them. Well, that is the Binyan of Shava. Here also in the thought part of the mitzvah, that we can understand it and grasp it and learn about it. Because the time of the exile, we're at the lowest spot. That there's nothing lower. Because we can't bring the offerings. That's how low we are. So then we're able to get it even to a higher level. There's an advantage of the fact that now we're not doing it in nitty-gritty. We're doing it in the spiritual sense, in the thought process, and in the speech. That's in this time, in this place. The way we do it, that's the way it is, and that's the highest level, that's the most optimum. This is quintessential Rebbe to say that the way we're doing it is the best, and that's how God wants it, even though we're in this time of concealment, etc. And then the Rebbe says, through this recognition, specifically through doing the offerings the way we have to do it now, in the time of the exile, like the Rebbe said, with the speech and thought, this is how we bring about the actual redemption, the true, full redemption. We'll bring Mashiach, then we'll do it then in the physical sense. May be the will of God through everything in our deeds and our service in this time, in all the things that we discussed. When the discourse was said on Shabbos afternoon, or right before the prayer of Mincha. On Shabbos afternoon, in the Mincha we say, as for me, my prayer for you, God, may it be a time of... may it be an auspicious time. She'inyana ha'es ratzon, and that's at the mincha, is a special time in the day, very auspicious. Nove elagula mitzvah shlema, will come to the true full redemption. Then we'll have the fulfillment, like we say in the prayers, that when Mashiach comes, then we will once again do before you the offerings that we're required to do. In the third temple, holy temple. The offerings then will be like the commandments that you commanded us according to your will. Then we'll have the fulfillment of the second, and you shall say to them, meaning the deed, the action, the actual bringing the offering. Din. The animals will be the court will be appointed, and they'll have they'll be restored, like it says in Isaiah, and I shall restore your judges like they were originally, and like we ultimately we read that in the Shabbos before Tisha B'av, after we read the tough news, but ultimately we'll have the restoration of all this. So the Beis Din will get the animals they'll be turned to offerings, etc. And Moses and Aaron will be with them, and all the Rabbeim, till the Rebbe, the prince, the Nasi of our generation, he is the head, and the body follows the head. Bnei will all go together to the holy temple, the third one, Baharabayas, which is on the Temple Mount, Yerushalayim in the holy city of Jerusalem, or Be'eretz HaKadosh, and in the Holy Land. And as the Torah says regarding the Holy Land, we're going to read it in a few weeks. Eretz Asher Geimer Tomideinu Vayelekecha B'Mreish Shana V'Dachri Shana, a land which, etc. The eyes of God are constantly, the eyes of the Lord your God are constantly upon it from the beginning of the year through the end of the year. That's a blessing for all times and all places. It's Yisrael, and has the eyes of God upon it, and we should be able to see that. And we should have all the security and all the good things. Here, from learning this Namaimah, it's also a blessing for anything in the current situation. And as it says, and the Medrash, you brought the Yalkut, it says that Yisrael is going to ultimately spread to the whole world. With happiness, joy, and gladness of heart.